If you're like a lot of people who live far away from Egypt, you may picture this land as a sea of undulating sand dunes, with a river and some pyramids thrown in there somewhere. But this really isn't a good picture of what Egypt looks like overall, either today or in the past. However, it is true that the Nile River was central to the ancient Egyptian way of life and their culture. Why was the Nile so important? Well, stay tuned because that's what we'll be talking about today. Welcome to the Dead Speak Online, where we demystify the words and lives of the ancient Egyptians through animated videos like this one. If you're new here, consider subscribing. When we look at a map of modern Egypt, it's true that most of it is dry desert. And while the borders in ancient times were actually quite similar to the modern ones, most people actually lived near the Nile or near an oasis, not out in the middle of the desert. And this remains mostly true today in modern Egypt as well. The Nile is over 4,000 miles, that is almost 7,000 kilometers long, and it runs through 11 modern countries. Within Egypt, its width averages about 1.7 miles, or 2.8 kilometers, but it can be as wide as 3 times that is over 4.5 miles. The Nile is generally thought to be the longest river in the world, but there has been some recent debate about this, since a 2007 study suggested that the Amazon River is actually longer. Longest river or not, the Nile was and continues to be central to the lives of millions of people. In ancient times, a big part of the reason for the importance of the Nile was that it would flood its banks every year during the summer. And this made farming possible without having to have an extensive irrigation system to move water around. Today, the Aswan High Dam prevents the Nile from flooding within Egypt, and modern farmers must rely on man-made methods for moving water around and also for conditioning the soil to make it good for growing food, while the ancient Egyptians didn't have to do these things because they had the Nile flood. This annual flood was brought on by heavy rains around the origin of the Nile, especially in what is now Ethiopia. On average, the Nile carried about 200 million cubic meters of water per day. But during the annual flood, this increased to 700 million cubic meters per day, a huge increase. Now, not only did this water flow down the mountains in Ethiopia and then over thousands of miles of riverbed, but it also carried along with it a good amount of small pieces of debris that we call silt. And this debris is made up of minerals worn off of the rocks as it went by, and little bits of plants also that got washed into the water. These really small particles make up what we call silt, and were delivered onto the land surrounding the Nile by the Nile waters, and then were left behind when the water receded. The soil that was left behind after the water receded was a rich, black-colored topsoil, and also along with this, basins of Nile water were also left behind, making the land perfect for growing a variety of crops, but especially grains like wheat and barley. The width of the floodplain, that is, the area of land that was covered by the annual floodwaters, varied throughout Egypt, but it provided most of Egypt with large swaths of fertilized and watered farmlands. In some places, these lands were as wide as 25 kilometers or 15.5 miles, while other areas had smaller floodplains and fewer farmable lands. These farmable areas where the Nile deposited its black river silt were called Kemet, or the Black Land in ancient Egyptian, in contrast to what the ancient Egyptians called the surrounding deserts, Desheret, the Red Land. In addition to its use as a fertilizer, this black silt was also used to make a variety of daily used items, such as pottery, which was used for cooking, storage, and eating food. It was also used for making bricks that would be used for building houses. Not only did the Nile provide water for drinking and for farming, but it also provided the environment for a big variety of wildlife. Among these wildlife were fish and birds that the ancient Egyptians hunted and which made up a big portion of their diet. It also provided the environment for a variety of reeds and rushes, which were then used in constructing a whole bunch of different things, everything from baskets and sandals to boats and houses. The Nile was also ancient Egyptians' main means of travel. The Nile originates in what's modern Ethiopia and Uganda, and then it flows northward towards Egypt. Because the river flows from south to north, travel going northward was generally easier because one could, most of the year at least, simply let the currents carry their boat northward. If you wanted to travel southward, though, you had to rely on the north wind. And this north wind was so important to the ancient Egyptians that it's even celebrated on some monuments to the dead. Because the Nile flows from south to north, the southern part of the country, which is upriver, is called Upper Egypt, or Tashemu in ancient Egyptian. While the northern part of the country, which is downriver, is called Lower Egypt, or Ta-Mehu in ancient Egyptian. And this can be confusing for modern people who think of north as up and south as down. Around the capital of ancient Egypt, and also modern Egypt today, the Nile splits into different branches, which are called a delta. And this is because they fan out in a triangular shape reminiscent of the Greek letter delta. The Nile and its surrounding marshy areas were so important to the ancient Egyptians that two plants that grew there in abundance, papyrus and water lily, sometimes also called a lotus, were symbols for Egypt, one representing Upper Egypt and the other representing Lower Egypt. Now, because of the particularly marshy nature of the delta, papyrus, which grows in marshes, was a symbol for Lower or Northern Egypt. The water lily, or lotus, was a symbol for Upper Egypt, that is, the southern part of the country. Now, these plants were not just pretty plants that were attractive, but they were actually used as political symbols, symbolizing the king's control over both Upper and Lower Egypt. And for this reason, you'll see them a lot in official art in ancient Egypt. So you'll see them, for example, on things like thrones that the king used, or statues of the king, or even in a variety of temple scenes. Whether king or commoner, the Nile was central to all ancient Egyptians' lives, but it could be fickle. It provided a means of transportation and also the vital floodwaters and fertilizer needed for farming. But in some years, it might also take away lives rather than give them. And this could happen from floods being either too high or too low, washing away villages and towns, or not providing enough water and fertilizer to grow enough food for everyone. Despite these fluctuations in the Nile flood that could be disastrous, the river was remarkably consistent in how much farmland it provided. And this attribute of ancient Egypt was well known in ancient times, leading the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus to write about farming in ancient Egypt, no doubt with a fair amount of exaggeration, saying that it was really quite easy, easier than in other lands. Quote, "Now, of course, they reap the fruits of the earth with less effort than anywhere else in the world. They do not have to plow the furrow or dig the soil. They can dispense with the tiresome labor in the field that other people must endure. As soon as the river has risen of its own accord, watered the arable land, and receded again, each of them sows his own plot and drives pigs onto it to tread the seed in. Then he awaits the harvest." End quote. If you're interested in learning more about ancient Egypt, check out my other videos. And make sure to take a look in the description below, where I have a list of books about ancient Egypt that I recommend. If you've enjoyed this video, do give it a thumbs up, and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss future videos like this one. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.